The horses needed feeding before full dark. Thomas moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, his boots scuffing against worn planks. He spoke softly to the bay mare, to the sorrel gelding, words he no longer wasted on people. The animals nickered in response, warm breath misting in the late October cold. Outside, cattle dotted the hillside like dark stones. 3 years he'd worked this land alone. 3 years since Martha's passing, the routine had become his comfort and his cage. Dust rose from the road as a wagon appeared. Thomas straightened, recognizing the team before he saw his daughter's face. Sarah drove with her younger brother James beside her, both wearing smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Papa," Sarah called, climbing down with a basket. "Brought you some preserves and cornmeal." "Wasn't necessary," Thomas said, but he took the basket. His hands, rough from work, looked too large holding something so carefully packed. James unhitched the horses, moving with the easy confidence of 17. "How you been?" "Pa, fine, just fine." Sarah's gaze swept the cabin, the tidy porch, the wood pile stacked with military precision, everything in order, everything empty. "You eating proper?" "I manage." They stayed for coffee, filling his cabin with careful chatter about town news and Sarah's husband in the coming winter. Thomas listened more than he spoke, watching his children watch him. Their concern hung in the air like smoke. "Hi." When they finally loaded up to leave, Sarah hugged him longer than usual. "You know you could come stay with us. The spare room's yours any time." "I'm all right here," Thomas said. "Got the stock to tend." James gripped his shoulder. "We'll be back next month." Thomas stood in the yard until the wagon disappeared down the valley road. The silence returned like a familiar ghost. He walked back inside, lit the lamp from habit, and sat at his table. His coffee had gone cold. The empty chair across from him seemed to grow larger in the lamplight. Martha used to sit there with her mending, humming old songs while he read the newspaper. Her laughter had filled this cabin once. Now only the wind spoke. Thomas stared at the dark window, seeing his own reflection. A man of 52, who looked older. A father who reassured his children with lies. A widower who'd forgotten what living felt like beyond the daily tasks that marked time passing. He drank the cold coffee anyway. Another evening. Another night. The animals would need feeding come dawn. The lamp burned until he finally stood and climbed the stairs to bed. His side of the mattress had worn smooth from 3 years of solitary sleep. Martha's side remained pristine, untouched. A monument to the past he couldn't release. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that. Thomas had made his peace with this half-life, or so he told himself each night before sleep finally came. The first hard frost came 2 weeks later, turning the grass silver by morning. Thomas worked through the cold, breath clouding as he mended fence line on the north pasture. His hands moved with muscle memory while his mind wandered nowhere in particular. Near dusk, he heard hoofbeats. A rider approached from the high trail, moving slow. Thomas watched from beside the barn as a woman on a weary chestnut horse stopped at his gate. She sat straight, despite obvious fatigue, maybe 50 years old, with gray threading through dark hair pulled back practical. Her clothes showed hard travel, but her eyes were clear and direct. "Evening," she called. "I'm heading down to the valley settlement, but I won't make it before full dark. Wondered if you might spare shelter for the night." "I can pay." Thomas hesitated. 3 years since anyone had asked to stay. 3 years since he'd wanted company. But frontier law was frontier law, and no decent man turned away a traveler after dark. No payment needed, he said. Opening the gate. Barn's got clean straw. There's a pump by the porch. Much obliged. She dismounted stiffly, leading her horse inside while Thomas lit a lantern. He showed her the empty stall, brought grain for her mount. She worked efficiently, unsaddling and rubbing down the chestnut with practiced hands. Not someone who expected others to do her work. "I'm Anne," she said finally. "Anne Brennan." "Thomas Granger. This your place?" "It is." She glanced toward the cabin, seemed to count windows, measure the size. "You work it alone?" "I do." Anne nodded, asked no more questions. Thomas found himself oddly relieved and oddly disappointed both. Inside, he heated beans and made cornbread, while Anne washed up at the basin. They ate with few words, but Thomas noticed how she studied the cabin, the single plate he'd set for himself before remembering her, the clean hearth with only one chair drawn close, the profound quietness that no amount of crackling fire could fill. "You're widowed," Anne said. "Not a question." Thomas's jaw tightened. 3 years now. "I'm sorry." She paused, turning her coffee cup. I lost my husband 5 years back. Spent a long time traveling after. Seemed easier than staying still with all that emptiness. Something in her voice made Thomas look up. She wasn't asking for sympathy, just stating fact. The way someone might mention weather or time of day. Anne set down her cup, met his eyes directly. "I'm tired of moving. Mr. Granger, need a place for winter, maybe longer. I noticed you work this land alone. And that's hard for one person. Come the deep cold. I manage fine. I say. I expect you do, but I have a proposition." She leaned forward slightly. "I'll stay if we can share this space equal. I'll cook and mend. You provide the firewood and tend the stock. We keep separate sleeping quarters. We respect each other's grief and don't push where we're not wanted." Thomas stared at her. "That's a peculiar offer." "Maybe so, but I don't need saving. Mr. Granger, and I won't try to save you. We'd just be two people making winter less lonely for both of us. Partnership, not charity." "I don't know that I want company." "Fair enough." Anne stood, carried her plate to the basin. "Think on it tonight. I'll be gone at dawn if you'd rather keep your solitude. No hard feelings either way." She headed for the barn before Thomas could respond. He sat alone at his table, the cabin somehow feeling emptier than before she'd arrived. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Outside, an owl called. Thomas listened to the familiar night sounds and the unfamiliar presence in his barn. Morning would bring a choice he hadn't expected to face. Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, staring at ceiling beams he'd helped Martha's father raise 20 years ago. His wife's presence filled the room like it always did at night. Not as ghost, but as memory so strong it felt physical. Martha had never met a stranger. She'd have welcomed Anne without hesitation. Probably insisted the woman take the spare room instead of the barn. She'd have made extra bread, asked about Anne's travels, found some way to ease the loneliness they both carried. "Would you mind?" Thomas whispered to the darkness. Would this be betraying you?" No answer came. It never did. But he remembered Martha's laugh, her generous heart, how she'd lived fully right up until the fever took her. She'd never chosen to stop living. That had been his decision alone. He thought of Sarah's worried face, of James trying too hard to be cheerful. A kid and I, of his children leaving each month with that same terrible relief in their eyes. Grateful he was still breathing, but knowing he wasn't really alive. Dawn came gray and cold. Thomas dressed and went downstairs, started coffee by habit. Through the window he saw lamplight in the barn. Anne would be saddling up, keeping her word about leaving. He poured 2 cups. When Anne emerged leading her horse, Thomas was waiting on the porch. She stopped at the gate, reading his face. "You can stay," he said. Voice rough from sleep and doubt. "But we do this proper. You take the back room upstairs. We share the main cabin. You got your own space. I got mine." Anne studied him a long moment. "And if one of us needs to leave, then they leave. No obligation past what we agree to each day." "That's fair." She tied her horse back in the barn, returned carrying her saddlebags. Thomas held the door open. The back room was small but clean, with a window facing east. Martha had used it for sewing. Thomas hadn't been inside since the funeral. Dust covered the narrow bed and small dresser. "I'll air it out," Anne said quietly. "There's extra blankets in the chest." They worked in careful silence that morning. Anne opened windows despite the cold, beat dust from the mattress, scrubbed the floor. Thomas brought in firewood. Checked the chimney flue. Replaced a cracked window pane. They moved around each other like dancers learning new steps. By midday, Anne was cooking. Not just beans this time, but stew with carrots and onions from her saddlebags. The smell filled the cabin. Thomas split wood behind the house, the axe rhythm steady and predictable. When he came in, she'd set 2 places at the table. They ate without much talk. But Thomas noticed she hummed while she worked, soft and unconscious, some old tune he didn't recognize. The sound should have felt intrusive. Instead, it made the cabin feel less like a tomb. After dinner, Anne washed dishes while Thomas read by the fire. Not like Martha used to sit across from him, but at the far end of the table with her own book, separate but present. The lamp burned between them, casting warm light on both their pages. Thomas glanced up once and caught her watching the fire. Her face held the same careful emptiness his probably did. The mask people wore when grief had nowhere left to go. She was keeping her word, not trying to fix him, not pushing. Just existing in the same space. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. Anne looked up. For what?" "For asking, instead of just needing." She nodded slowly. "We've both had enough of being needed. I expect. Nice to just be for a while." Thomas returned to his book but didn't read another word. The cabin sounded different tonight, less like silence and more like quiet. He wasn't sure yet if that was good or terrifying. Maybe both. November settled over the high country with cold that sharpened edges. Thomas fell into new rhythms without meaning to. He woke to the smell of coffee already made. He found his shirts mended before he noticed they'd needed it. "Hey, Mommer, I burst fire." Small changes appeared like snow accumulating, each flake insignificant, until suddenly the world looked different. Anne kept her word about boundaries. She worked in the kitchen or the back room, left him alone when he wanted silence. But gradually, Thomas found himself lingering at the table after meals, offering brief observations about weather or the cattle. "A bussin' state." She'd respond with her own thoughts. Nothing heavy. Just the ordinary talk people share. "That sorrel gelding's got a cough," he said one morning. "I noticed. Might try some garlic in his feed." Garlic. "Old Drover taught me that trick. Works more often than not." Thomas tried it. The cough cleared up within days. He didn't thank Anne directly, but he mentioned it was clever thinking. She'd smiled into her coffee cup. The cabin changed in ways Thomas couldn't quite name. Curtains hung cleaner in the windows. Bread cooled on the counter, filling the air with yeast and warmth. The hearth stayed swept. Small touches that made the space feel tended rather than merely occupied. Anne told stories while she cooked. Nothing too personal, but enough to fill the silence. About a stubborn trading post clerk in Laramie, about a dust storm in Kansas that turned day to night, about a family of foxes she'd watched from her bedroll one dawn. Thomas listened, sometimes adding his own brief memories of cattle drives or fence-mending disasters. 2 weeks in, he made a dry comment about the bay mare's attitude. "She's got opinions about everything. Reminds me of my daughter." Anne laughed. The sound startled them both. It filled the cabin like light through a window. Warm and unexpected and somehow necessary. Thomas froze mid-sip of his coffee. Cup halfway to his mouth. "Sorry," Anne said, still smiling, "but that's a perfect description. I met a horse like that in Colorado. Thought she was the smartest creature on 4 legs, and wanted everyone to know it." Thomas set down his cup carefully. The mare's usually right. Though, that's the problem. Smart women usually are. Something in Thomas's chest loosened slightly, like a fist unclenching after years of holding tight. The feeling terrified him. He stood abruptly, mumbled about checking the stock, and fled to the barn. Outside, he leaned against the fence rail, breath clouding in the cold. The bay mare watched him with dark, knowing eyes. Inside the cabin, he could hear Anne humming that same old tune. The sound carried through the walls, soft and persistent as wind. Thomas had spent 3 years building walls around his grief, protecting it, protecting himself. But Anne's laughter had found a crack he didn't know existed, and instead of feeling like invasion, it felt like remembering what warmth was. He stayed in the barn longer than the stock required, but eventually the cold drove him back inside. Anne glanced up from kneading bread but said nothing about his long absence. She just poured him fresh coffee and returned to her work. And writes, that night, lying in bed, Thomas realized he'd thought about Martha without the usual crushing ache. He'd remembered her with Anne's laughter still echoing in his mind, and somehow both had existed together without conflict. The guilt arrived immediately, but softer than before. More question than accusation, maybe. He thought before sleep came. Maybe a man could honor the past without being buried by it. Maybe. December's first snow fell on a Thursday. Thomas woke to white silence and Anne already up, starting breakfast. They'd settled into something that almost felt normal. Though neither acknowledged it aloud, late morning brought the sound of wagon wheels. Thomas looked out to see Sarah and James arriving earlier than expected. His stomach tightened. 2 horses in the corral now, smoke from an obviously tended fire. His daughter would notice everything. My children, he told Anne quickly. I'll make myself scarce if you... No. The word came out firmer than he intended. No, stay, it's fine. Sarah and James entered with supplies and stopped short, seeing the woman at the stove. Thomas watched his daughter's eyes take in everything. The set table, the bread cooling, the curtains, his father standing straight instead of hunched. Sarah, James, this is Anne Brennan. Thomas said, she's staying through winter, helping with the work. Ma'am, James said, recovering first. He had his mother's manners. Sarah's face showed careful neutrality. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Brennan. Just Anne. Please. And you're Thomas's daughter. I can see it in your bearing. Anne smiled. Your father speaks highly of you both. Come sit. There's stew and fresh bread. They sat. Awkward at first. But Anne had a way of drawing people out without pushing. She asked about town, about Sarah's husband, about James's work at the livery. She listened with genuine interest. Responded with her own small stories, not trying to impress or replace, just being present. Thomas watched his daughter watch him. Sarah's eyes kept returning to her father's face, searching for something. He tried to look normal, whatever that meant. Tried not to notice how good it felt having his children here without their usual suffocating worry. This stew is wonderful, Sarah said finally. Thank you. Your father provides excellent venison. Makes my job easy. Over dinner, Anne told a story about a pompous banker in Cheyenne who'd demanded special treatment at an inn where she'd been working. She mimicked his voice, his gestures. James laughed outright. Even Sarah smiled. Thomas felt his own face changing, muscles moving in ways they'd forgotten. When Anne caught his eye mid-story, something warm passed between them. Not romantic, not yet. Just recognition of shared space. Shared ease. His children noticed. After the meal, Sarah helped Anne with dishes while Thomas and James tended the horses. Inside, Sarah spoke quietly. How long have you been here? About 6 weeks. And my father. Sarah stopped, searching for words. He's a good man, Anne said. Scrubbing a pot, carries his grief with real honor. Your mother must have been remarkable to inspire such devotion. Sarah's eyes filled. She was. And he loved her so much. When she died, it was like he died too. Just kept breathing out of habit. I know that grief, Anne said softly. Lost my own husband. Spent 3 years wandering because I couldn't face sitting still with that emptiness. She rinsed the pot, set it aside. But lately I've been learning that staying frozen doesn't honor the dead. It just wastes the time the living have left. Is that why you're here? I'm here because your father needed help and I needed a place to heal. Nothing more complicated than that. But I will say this. He laughs now. Not often. But it happens. That seems worth something. Sarah looked through the doorway at her father outside, watching him move with more energy than she'd seen in years. When she turned back, tears tracked down her face. Thank you. Thank you for giving him back to us. Even a little. He gave himself back. Sarah, I just happened to be here when he was ready. Later, as the wagon pulled away. Sarah hugged Thomas longer than usual. I like her. Papa, I like seeing you smile again. Thomas watched them disappear down the snowy road. When he turned back, Anne stood on the porch, giving him space for this moment. He walked slowly toward the cabin, toward the woman waiting, toward something he couldn't quite name yet. Inside, he stood at Martha's photograph. His children approved. That mattered more than he'd realized. But their departure had triggered the old guilt again, sharper now because he'd let himself feel happy for a few hours. I'm not forgetting you, he whispered to the photograph. Behind him, Anne moved quietly in the kitchen, not listening, not judging, just being. Thomas closed his eyes, caught between two worlds, the weight of the past and the tentative promise of something new. He didn't know how to choose. Didn't know if choosing was even possible. Thomas began pulling back the next day, not dramatically, just small retreats that added up to distance. He took his breakfast early. Before Anne woke, he worked longer hours outside. When she spoke, He answered in single words. Anne noticed. How could she not? But she didn't push. Didn't demand explanations. She just continued her work. Her presence steady as winter stars. Somehow that made it worse. Thomas wanted her to be angry, to give him a reason to justify his withdrawal. Instead, she remained patient, respectful, exactly what she'd promised to be. A week passed in careful silence. Then another. The cabin felt colder despite the fire. Thomas told himself it was better this way, safer. Why? He'd let himself forget for one afternoon with his children, and the guilt had hit him like an avalanche. Better to stay frozen. Better to keep Martha's memory protected behind walls. One evening, Anne set dinner on the table and sat across from him. Thomas ate quickly, preparing to escape to the barn. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked quietly. Thomas's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. No. Then why does it feel like you're trying to disappear while staying in the same room? I'm not. He stopped, unable to finish the lie. It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are irony. Thomas set down his fork, couldn't meet her eyes. When my children were here, I felt, I don't know, happy. Maybe. For the first time in 3 years. And then they left and I realized what that meant. What did it mean? That I was betraying Martha. The words came out raw. That I was letting go. That their mother's memory matters less than my own comfort. Anne was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you think happiness means, forgetting? Doesn't it? No. Thomas, it doesn't. She stood, moved to the window. Snow fell outside. Endless white. Grief isn't a competition for who stays loyal longest. It's not a test of love to see how much misery you can endure. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a noble disguise. Thomas's hands clenched. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Anne's voice stayed calm. I understand that you built a fortress around your grief and called it devotion. That you're terrified if you let yourself live again. It means Martha didn't matter. But Thomas, she mattered. She'll always matter. Nothing changes that. Not laughter. Not companionship. Not joy. The only thing that dishonors her memory is you choosing to die slowly, instead of living the life she'd want. For you. How do you know what she'd want? Because I know what I'd want if I were her. Anne turned from the window. I'd want my husband to remember me with love. Yes, but I'd also want him to keep living, to raise our children with hope instead of sorrow, to open his heart if someone kind came along. I wouldn't want him punishing himself for my death. Thomas stood abruptly. Come spring, maybe you should head to the valley like you planned. Anne's face stayed neutral. But he saw the hurt flash in her eyes. If that's what you want, it's better this way. For who, Thomas had no answer. He grabbed his coat and fled to the barn, into the cold and darkness where he could breathe, where he didn't have to face truths that cut too close. The horses shuffled in their stalls. Thomas leaned against a beam, fighting the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with winter cold. Anne was right. Some part of him knew she was right. But knowing didn't make choosing any easier. He'd gotten what he thought he wanted. Protection for his grief. Safety in solitude. So why did it feel like he was losing Martha all over again? January came with storms that trapped them inside for days. The cabin shrank. Every shared space became unavoidable. Every silence filled with words. Neither spoke. Anne prepared to leave come spring. Quietly packing her things in subtle ways, Thomas pretended not to notice. The blizzard hit on a Monday night, wind howling like something alive, snow piled against the windows. Thomas fed the fire while Anne cooked in tense quiet. They'd barely spoken in weeks beyond necessities. That night, Thomas lay awake listening to the storm rage. In 3 months, Anne had been exactly what she'd promised. Respectful, helpful, asking nothing he couldn't give. And he was sending her away because she'd committed the crime of making him feel human again. Downstairs, he heard movement. Anne was up too, unable to sleep. Thomas stayed in bed another hour before finally giving up. He descended to find her at the table, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the fire. Couldn't sleep either. He said, "Storm's loud." Thomas poured cold coffee, sat at the far end of the table. The words built in his throat, bitter and necessary. "About spring. I think it's best if—" "I know." Anne interrupted quietly. "You've made that clear. I'll go as soon as the snow breaks enough for travel." Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. Wind hammered the walls. "Can I tell you something?" Anne asked finally. "You can throw me out in this storm if you want, but I need to say it first." Thomas nodded, wary. "I lost my husband 5 years back. Samuel was his name. He was good and kind, and when he died, I thought I'd die too. Spent 3 years frozen solid, moving from place to place, but never really going anywhere. Just running from the emptiness." She pulled the quilt tighter. "Then one day I woke up and realized I'd wasted 3 years Samuel would never get. 3 years of sunsets he'd have loved. 3 years of laughter and stories and simple joys. And staying frozen didn't honor him. It just meant we both lost those years instead of just him." On Thomas's throat tightened. "It's not that simple." "It never is. But loving someone doesn't end when they die." "Thomas, neither does your own life. Those two truths have to exist together somehow." "I don't know how," Thomas said, and his voice broke on the words. "I don't know how to move forward without leaving her behind. Don't know how to open my heart without feeling like I'm erasing everything we had." Anne leaned forward, firelight casting shadows across her face. "You're not erasing anything. You're carrying it with you, taking the love Martha gave you, and using it to keep living, instead of slowly dying. That's not betrayal. Thomas, that's the greatest honor you could give her memory." "What if I can't? What if I'm too broken?" "Then you stay broken. But you don't have to stay alone in it." She paused. "Your Martha wouldn't want you lonely. I never met her. But I know that much. Just like my Samuel wouldn't want me afraid to love again. Maybe they'd both tell us we're being damn fools, wasting perfectly good lives on perfectly pointless guilt." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking. Exactly. More like ice starting to thaw. "I'm scared," he admitted. Scared of forgetting her. Scared of dishonoring her. Scared of feeling anything that isn't grief. Because at least grief means she mattered. You say, she mattered. Thomas. She'll always matter. But so do you. So does the time you have left. So does the possibility of companionship with someone who understands your wound, because she carries her own. Anne's voice gentled. "I'm not asking you to forget Martha or replace her. I'm asking you to consider that. Maybe there's room in a heart for both yesterday's love and tomorrow's hope." The fire popped. Outside, The storm raged on. Inside, Thomas sat with tears on his face. He didn't bother wiping away. 3 years of carefully controlled grief finally cracking. "Stay," he said quietly. "Please stay. Not just until spring. Stay." Anne reached across the table. Her hand found his. They sat like that while the storm howled, two broken people holding on to each other in the darkness, neither one saving the other, but both choosing not to face the cold alone. February brought the first hints of thaw. Ice dripped from the eaves at midday. The air smelled different, like possibility. Thomas woke before dawn and did something he hadn't done in months. He made 2 cups of coffee and waited. When Anne emerged, surprised and pleased, Thomas gestured to the second cup. They sat together watching sunrise paint the snow gold and pink. No words needed, just presence. Later, Thomas cleared his throat. "There's something I need to do. Wondered if you'd come with me." Of course. They bundled against the cold and walked up the ridge behind the cabin. The snow was knee-deep in places, but Thomas knew the path by heart. He'd walked it alone 100 times. At the crest, a small fenced plot overlooked the valley. A simple wooden cross marked the grave. "Martha," Thomas said quietly. "This is where she rests." Anne stood respectfully silent. Thomas brushed snow from the cross with bare hands, then just stood there, searching for words he'd never said aloud. "I brought someone to meet you," he began, feeling foolish and necessary both. "Her name's Anne. She's been staying at the cabin through winter. She's widowed too, lost her husband Samuel. The wind moved through bare aspens, creating sound like whispered conversation. "I've been scared," Thomas continued. "Scared that moving forward meant abandoning you, that finding any kind of happiness would somehow diminish what we had. But Anne helped me understand something. Helped me see that maybe you wouldn't want me frozen in place, slowly dying of loneliness." His voice caught. Anne's hand found his gloved one and held tight. You were the best part of my life. Martha, you made me better than I was. You taught me how to love, how to be a father, how to find joy in simple things. And I think..." Thomas stopped, gathering courage. "I think if our places were switched, I'd want you to keep living, to find companionship if someone kind came along, to remember me with love, but not let that love become a prison." The valley stretched below them, vast and beautiful. Morning light touched everything with gold. "Anne's good people," Thomas said. "She's patient and honest, and she understands grief, because she carries her own. She's not trying to replace you. No one could do that. But she's offered partnership, friendship, maybe more in time. And I think she'd have liked you. Your straight talk and generous heart." He paused. "And I think you'd tell me I was being a damn fool, that a man's got no business wasting a second chance at joy when joy's rare enough to begin with." Saw. Tears froze on Thomas's face. Anne held his hand, waiting. The wind gentled. "So, I'm going to try." Thomas whispered, "Going to try to honor what we had by actually living instead of just existing. Going to take your love with me and make room for something new alongside it, not instead of alongside." He touched the cross one last time. "Thank you, Martha, for everything. I'll love you till I die, but I'm going to live until then." Anne stepped forward, placed her own hand on the cross. "Thank you for raising a good man," she said softly. "I'll try to be worthy of the trust you've left me." They stood together in the morning light. Three souls connected across the boundary of death and life. Then Thomas turned, took Anne's hand properly this time, and together they walked back down the ridge. The cabin door stood open when they returned, lamplight spilling onto the porch. Thomas realized home wasn't a place you defended from change. Home was something you built with open hands and open hearts. "Thank you," Anne said at the doorway, "for letting me walk that path with you. Thank you for being patient while I figured out I wanted to." They went inside together. The cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Not because of the fire, though that helped, but because it held life again, laughter again, hope again. Outside, the first crows of spring called from the pines. Winter was ending, but it felt more like a beginning. Early March painted the world in mud and promise. Sarah and James arrived on a Saturday to find their father and Anne working in easy synchronization. Anne tended a small garden plot she'd started by the kitchen window. Coaxing early greens from thawed earth, Thomas repaired the paddock fence, humming an old tune their mother used to sing. "Papa," Sarah called. Uncertain, Thomas turned, grinning in a way they hadn't seen since before Martha died. "Sarah James, come on up. We weren't expecting you till next week." James studied his father's face, then Anne's, then the cabin that somehow looked more alive despite nothing physical having changed. Thought we'd surprise you." "It's a good surprise." Thomas glanced at Anne, who'd stood and wiped dirt from her hands. Something passed between them. A question and answer both. "Actually, there's something we need to tell you. Anne's staying. Not just through spring. Permanent. If she's willing." Anne smiled. "I'm willing." Sarah's eyes filled immediately. She crossed the yard and embraced Anne without hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." "Your father brought himself back," Anne said. "I just happened to be nearby when he was ready." James gripped his father's shoulder, man to man, approval clear in his eyes. "Mama would be happy for you." "Pa, seeing you like this again," Thomas's voice roughened. "I think she would too." They gathered in the cabin for dinner. Real dinner, with roast chicken and vegetables and pie that Anne had made that morning. Conversation flowed easy, punctuated by laughter that felt natural instead of forced. Sarah told stories about her children. James shared news from town. Anne contributed observations that made everyone smile. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his usual spot, but transformed. Instead of isolation, he felt surrounded, his children across from him, their approval warming him better than any fire. Anne beside him, her quiet strength a gift he no longer feared accepting. After the children left, promising to visit more often, Thomas and Anne stood on the porch watching twilight paint the mountains purple. The lamp glowed in the window behind them, golden and welcoming. "You reckon we've got ourselves a home here?" Thomas said, "Reckon we do." Anne leaned against the rail, looking out at the frontier that had once seemed impossibly lonely. "Strange how things work out. 6 months ago, I was just drifting, and you were just surviving. And now we're living." She smiled at him. "Together, but separate. Partners respecting each other's past while building something new. It's not what I expected when I rode up to your gate last November. It's not what I expected either." Thomas admitted, "But I'm grateful for it. Grateful you were stubborn enough to stay despite me being a fool. You weren't a fool. You were grieving. There's a difference." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to evening sounds, horses moving in the paddock, wind through pine trees, a world full of life they'd both been too wounded to notice before. Nice die Geißen nicht har, Thomas thought of Martha, buried on the ridge with a view of everything she'd loved. He didn't feel guilty anymore for standing here with Anne. Instead, he felt like he was honoring both women, one by cherishing her memory, the other by choosing to live fully in the present. You know what Martha used to say? Thomas asked softly. What guessy? She'd say a heart's got room enough for yesterday's love and tomorrow's hope. Used to think she was talking about the children. But maybe she meant more than that. Anne took his hand. Wise woman. She was. Thomas squeezed her fingers gently. You'd have liked each other. I think so too. The lamp behind them cast their shadows long across the porch, two figures silhouetted against warm light. The frontier stretched before them, vast and full of promise instead of emptiness. Winter's isolation had transformed into something gentler, something that felt like peace. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. 2 places were set at the table for breakfast tomorrow. 2 quilts hung on separate bedroom doors, 2 lives intertwined without erasing what came before. Thomas had learned the hard way that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room. Room for memory and new joy. Room for grief and gratitude. Room for the past that shaped you, and the future you're brave enough to build. Come on, Anne said, tugging his hand. It's getting cold. They went inside together, closing the door on March's lingering chill, but the lamp stayed lit in the window. A beacon that no longer spoke of loneliness. Now it whispered welcome. Now it promised home. And somewhere on the ridge, Thomas imagined Martha smiling, approving, grateful that her man had finally chosen living over merely surviving, that he'd found someone worthy to walk beside him through whatever years remained. The frontier was vast and sometimes cruel, but tonight, in a small cabin in Montana's high country, 2 wounded souls had found healing, not by forgetting their pain, but by refusing to let pain be the only thing they carried forward. Companionship doesn't erase grief. It just makes room for joy alongside memory. And sometimes, Thomas thought as he sat beside Anne with coffee and conversation, sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.